This episode of the AD History Podcast is brought to you by listeners like you, contributing through the crowdfunding platform Patreon. Learn more about how you can support the show by visiting patreon.com/ADHistoryPodcast and the exclusive benefits that await your generous support. Join us in the effort to keep creating the AD history you deserve by visiting patreon.com/ADHistoryPodcast. Thank you. Have you ever wondered how bumpy the road was for Buddhism in its harrowing journey establishing itself in China? Or at what point Attila the Hun truly established his infamous reputation in history? Well, do we have a story for you?
This is the AD History Podcast, weaving a tapestry of world history from 1AD to HD. Powered by TGNR. Get your good news that's real news at TGNR by visiting tgnreview.com. Now here are your hosts, Paul K. DiCostanzo and Patrick Foote.
And brought to you via London and New York City, you are listening to the AD History Podcast. I am Paul K. DiCostanzo, and I am joined by my co-host, Patrick Foote. How are you today, Patrick?
I am great, Paul. As always, happy to be here, happy to be recording. How are you feeling?
I can't complain. I'm always happy when we're doing AD history.
Yeah.
And we have some really good topics here today.
Yeah, we have some really exciting stuff today. So I am actually heading back to my beloved China for the first time in quite a while. And there's some interesting stuff kicking off there. Paul, what are you actually covering this episode?
Well, I finish up my...
Of course,
my trifecta.
Yes, the holy trifecta.
Yes, on Attila the Hun. But you have something of a spiritual successor to a segment I did all the way back in our first season, which was Buddhism arriving in China.
Exactly, yeah. So you talked about Buddhism arriving in China, and I'm talking about Buddhism facing some challenges in China, which is so strange to hear because today we link Buddhism quite deeply with China, I'd say.
On a historical basis, more so than the current situation.
I guess, yeah, more historically than at the moment, yeah. But it's a country very much linked with Buddhism in many ways. So to hear that it was persecuted in the country is quite shocking to hear. And this is the first persecution of Buddhism in China I'm going to be covering today, and it definitely isn't the last.
No, certainly not. It's had a turbulent history in terms of its becoming really integrated into especially Han Chinese culture. You know, the Han Chinese supermajority that make up the country for the most part. So I'm looking forward to you covering that because that's always really interesting stuff.
I'm looking forward to hearing how things wrap up with Attila.
They wrap, I can assure you. But one thing is for sure, that it is important enough that we are still talking about it now, 1,600 years later, which is truly an amazing feat by any measure you can possibly imagine. And so with all of that in mind and all of it out of the way, let's lay down our necessary, obligatory, now legendary AD History Podcast ground rules. 1. Evaluate events in the context they occurred. 2. Over the span of recorded history, the way it was recorded, its methodology, and the facts that are important have changed immensely. How we view history today is not necessarily how we viewed it 50 years ago. 3. Nothing in history was inevitable. And 4. History and the past is like a different country. Well, Patrick, it is time to continue the story of Buddhism in China. And in this case, getting into one of the first major persecutions of that religion and that truly epically old part of the world and all the history that it encompasses. So, as I like to say always, Mr. Foote, Sir Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paul. And something I find so interesting about all this is because the fact persecutions have actually been a mainstay of AD history for some time now. We had the Romans persecuting Christians, and then the Romans persecuting pagans because they were Christian now. Very strange. And of course, just about everyone persecuting the Jews. Like, persecution has been quite a mainstay here on AD history. But it wasn't only something happening in the Western ancient world, as it was in this decade that a series of persecutions actually kicked off in ancient China. And these, as we talked about, were persecutions against Buddhism. The religion that is, of course, as I said, deeply linked to China and the nation today from a historical perspective, to some degree in modern China itself. But on top of this, there was other things happening in China as well. Because it was around this time, at about 440 AD, that Chinese history was finally escaping one of its more chaotic periods. This was with the end of the 16 Kingdoms period. We mentioned this briefly, the 16 Kingdoms of China. It kicked off in 304 AD, so way back then we would have talked about it. And it saw northern China split into 16 volatile kingdoms. And this period actually came to a formal end in 439 AD, so just a couple years prior to the decade this episode is about. And one of these 16 kingdoms was called the Northern Wei dynasty. And it was this kingdom who was able to unify northern China for the first time since 304 AD in 439 AD. And this, of course, ended the 16 Kingdoms chaos. And it was also in 440 AD that southern China had become unified into the Liu Song dynasty. So this actually sort of created the next big period of Chinese history. You know, we've had the Han dynasty, we've had the War of the Three Kingdoms, we've had the 16 Kingdoms. This is a period dubbed the Northern and Southern Dynasties period. So it's another great big moment in Chinese history. And of course, during all this, Buddhism was playing its role too. We've talked about Buddhism arriving in Han China all the way back in the first series of this podcast. And it came to the land via Indian monks on the Silk Road. And it didn't arrive easily in China either. It actually took a few centuries for it to become widely spread and accepted. And something that really helped solidify Buddhism in China was how well it integrated with Taoism. Now, Paul, I think you've actually talked about Taoism in the past.
Only in passing,
Yeah.
never a complete explanation. You know, at this point, and I guess this is certainly something worth mentioning, is that even today, even though, you know, the current ruling body in China is officially atheist and has a very tenuous relationship with any sort of organized religion by design, Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, over the 2,000 years that all of them have been present, have created this very culturally hybrid mechanism, especially in Han Chinese culture, where they are all kind of observed and they all kind of have found a way to fuse with each other.
Yeah.
Which is really fascinating. It's something that could only have happened over a long period of time. But I am curious, based on your research, because I'm not up on this enough to be 100% sure. In this case, what's the difference between Taoism and Buddhism? And of course, the one or other portion of this integration that I just mentioned is Confucianism. So what's the difference between Buddhism and Taoism, and where does the Confucianism fall into all of this?
So the three of them are all actually vaguely similar in the way they're believed and followed and whatnot. And they've actually kind of, like you said, integrated. That integration is called the three teachings. And these sort of cover all different aspects of the life, universe, and everything. I would say, however, and it's going to play into this whole persecution going forward into the rest of this episode, the key difference between Buddhism versus Taoism and Confucianism is the fact that Taoism and Confucianism are Chinese-made concepts. They were born and bred in China. And despite how linked Buddhism now is with China, it is Indian in origin. It's interesting because when we think of modern India, we don't really think of Buddhism at all. We much more think Hindi and various other religions, of course. Where we don't think Buddhism, it's not particularly linked with India these days, but it came from there. I'd say one of the key differences between the three is that fact. Of course, Confucianism comes from the philosopher Confucius. Buddhism comes from Buddha. I've forgotten their actual name. I don't know if there's someone
well, I believe the
Taoism.
first Buddha's actual name is Siddhartha Gautama.
Correct.
But even though we do not associate Buddhism so much with the Indian subcontinent these days, in this case, the current Dalai Lama that's living in exile outside of Tibet have been given sanctuary in India, I believe.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go. There's something I find interesting as well with Buddhism is Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka is somewhere I've been there before, really enjoyed my time there. And it is like
you're the only person who's ever had an elephant spook up and actually surprise them.
Yes, yeah, it's quite hard because they're quite big, but I'm very unobservant in that way. And that's a Buddhist nation. It's primarily Buddhist. Sri Lanka's fascinating because it's got so many different things going on there. You turn a corner, you're at a church, you turn another corner, you're at a mosque, you turn another corner, you're at a Hindu temple. It's really fascinating place, but it is predominantly Buddhism, and that's probably, you don't get more South Asian, not Southeast Asian, but you probably don't get more South Asian than Sri Lanka. So there is a small Buddhist alcove just off the coast of India as well.
Now, is Sri Lanka, during the Raj period, was it known as Ceylon?
Yes, it's had many names. So Ceylon was like a British Ceylon, it was known as. You still hear like Ceylon tea. There's other things like it was called Serendip, which is where we get the term serendipity from because of an ancient story. Yeah, Sri Lanka's had many names.
Okay, I was curious about that.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you get into a certain point of history that you study a lot, you start seeing these names thrown around, and they're referring to places that have since been renamed. So I was curious if that was indeed the case.
Ceylon is in fact Sri Lanka. But going back to Buddhism, and something worth highlighting is that it was actually during the 16 Kingdoms period, Buddhism was really widely regarded and had a huge growth during this period. So the 16 Kingdoms were ruled by barbarians. It became about due to a period of time called the Five Barbarian Invasion, besides the point. And these barbarians really enjoyed Buddhism. They liked the mystical aspects to it. It was just something they hadn't really heard of before, and it just appealed to them. And this, of course, included the Northern Wei dynasty, who were strong Buddhists. This was a really devoutly Buddhist empire. So it makes it strange that one of their rulers, Emperor Taiwu, he was the one who actually ordered the first Buddhist persecution. So let's talk about Emperor Taiwu, because he was the one who ordered this first Buddhist persecution. He was born in 423 AD, so in the same century. So he was a pretty young guy when this started kicking off. And he was the emperor who unified much of northern China and ended the 16 Kingdoms period. And he was a devout Taoist. And it's interesting, even though Taoism and Buddhism had come somewhat interlinked, there was some people did see a difference between the two of them. And one of the reasons that Taiwu was such a devout Taoist was because of his prime minister, one Su Hao. This prime minister of Su Hao was also a devout Taoist. And because Taiwu, Emperor Taiwu, was so deeply under his influence, it meant he was too. He really had the ear of this emperor here, including religion.
Now, you use the term prime minister, which is a very interesting term in this time, in this place. Now, when you say that, do you mean somebody that's just the effective administrative governing head of the government at the behest of the sovereign, the monarch, the emperor?
So I did look into this, and from what I can gather, it just said he was their prime minister. Like, it didn't really look into it much more. I'm having a look into it now, but like, I thought it was fascinating. It really did catch me out, the fact that you used the term prime minister, because it seems like somewhat of a more relatively modern term and a relatively Western term as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, so to see it used here, I'm trying to look into it now. I'm on Su Hao's Wikipedia page as we speak. And I can't see anything other than like another role like for him.
It kind of just sounds like he was the guy appointed to handle the day-to-day of governing.
He was a shangshu, that's what it's saying. So maybe that was the more correct term for it, a shangshu.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure, but it did strike me as interesting that he was referred to as prime minister, because it's just not a term we deeply link with this time period.
So why was Su Hao so anti-Buddhist?
So this comes into play saying about the key difference. Do you remember how I said one of the key differences between Taoism and Buddhism is the fact that Taoism was Chinese natively, whereas Buddhism was an import from India? That's one of the key reasons why Su Hao saw Buddhism as this thing that was kind of invading China, this non-native entity that was taking over the nation, taking over his empire. And he didn't like that. It was just a bit of nationalism, really, where we had something like Taoism, which was so distinctly Chinese in creation and origin. He wanted his own nation's religion to be the religion of his people, not a religion that came from another part of the world. So that seems to be the main reason why.
So since we're still well before the advent of the nation state, can we truly call it nationalist, or is it more just a cultural supremacy thing?
Cultural supremacy is a much better term. I was just using nationalist as the first word that came to my head for that kind of thought pattern. But yes, definitely. That is much more sense. 'Cause you're right. This isn't a nation. This is a empire or a dynasty, whatever term you want to use. But suffice to say, having a Taoist emperor and prime minister of a largely Buddhist empire wasn't the best of ideas. Taiwu and his prime minister Su Hao wanted Buddhism gone from their empire and found a way to do as much. And this was in 446 AD, which is right slap bang in the middle of this decade. Taiwu was fighting a Zhongyu rebel named Gai Wu.
A Xiongnu rebel?
Yeah, Xiongnu. I don't know who exactly they were. I did look into it a little bit, but
we've come across Xiongnu before with that specific term, because though it's not definitively proven, there's a lot of individuals who are of the belief that at least part of the Xiongnu is the origination point of the European Huns we've been talking so much about.
Okay then. Gosh, my brain is like a sieve sometimes, Paul. How you keep hold of all this is beyond me. But no, that must make sense at all. I'm looking at where they originated from. That does make a ton of sense.
I was just curious about that, because when you said that, I was like, Xiongnu. Like, we've been here before.
That's ringing a bell in your head that ain't ringing my... But no, there's a Xiongnu rebel called Gai Wu. And it's actually during this campaign against the Gai Wu that weapons were discovered within a Buddhist temple. And this was enough ammunition, pun intended potentially, to convince Taiwu that the Buddhists were against him, and ergo the enemy. And I have no historical evidence to back me up on this. This is the story. You check most sources. The story goes... I
think you and I, our minds were going to the same place on this one. It's like, is this a false flag?
Totally. I mean, all the sources you read say this is what happened. This is all we know from the history, that Taiwu found weapons in a Buddhist temple. But like, was that really there? Did that actually happen? Is that where that's where you thought a false flag as well, Paul?
Yeah, because you figure, well, first off, I'm going to put a total disclaimer here. We have no definitive way to answer this.
No, totally not.
There's at least a decent chance that it could very well be true. However, there have been many times in history when one is looking to create the political capital and will, especially when it comes to persecution, by basically setting up a situation that is not actually what happened, but that's what they're selling to people.
Totally.
That ultimately justifies the actions they've been looking to take.
And when I first read that, it just struck me like, weapons in a Buddhist temple? That sounds odd. It does sound like a great setup. It sounds like a great way to set up these people to justify doing something against them. But so this in turn kicked off Taiwu's first Buddhist persecution. This was the first of a series of persecutions, and these were dubbed the Three Disasters of Wu.
Why the name?
So, of course, I was interested in this name, the Three Disasters of Wu. And it all has to do with the emperors at the time who were doing the persecuting. All of them had Wu, or specifically the Chinese character for Wu, somewhere within their name. So we see it with Taiwu here. The latter part of that name is Wu. When we cover the next ones, we'll find it there as well.
Well, something I'm curious if you've noticed this in your experiences doing Name Explain, in regards to terms and names that come from China, going back a fair way, that there seems to be almost this reoccurring quality in the names that they come up with, these terms, where there always is a specific number within them.
Yeah.
Not just denoting, like, for example, how many kingdoms there were, but, like, even more recent than that. You have the Gang of Four. I think Mao undertook the campaign of, it was either 100 or 1,000 flowers. It's something that I see again and again and again.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you've noticed this.
Oh, no, I have. There's always numbers. In historical events, a lot of them have numbers in their names. I think when we were doing this last year, the last time we talked about China, it's like the three disasters of Wu are part of the larger something as the four persecutions. And there's other things. I think there's like the 16 kingdom period, the 3 dynasties. There are always numbers in these events. I don't know the history behind it, why they're so number centric, and making sure that's a key part of like how their history is remembered. But it is definitely a reoccurring theme. And it's interesting stuff.
I was curious if you noticed that as well.
No, I had. And something else in regards to names. Chinese emperors have like different names after they die and before they
it's just like Japanese emperors as well.
Yeah, it's that's something I need to make a video on one day as well.
Like, for example, during Hirohito's reign, when he died, it became known posthumously as the Showa dynasty.
Yeah, it's fascinating, strange stuff. Something I definitely should make a video on. So as I said,
totally.
There were 4 persecutions all in all, but just 3 of them were Wu-themed disasters. And I think coincidentally as well, we had Gai Wu. So Gai Wu was the guy, he was the Zhongyu rebel who kicked off this whole persecution. So all of the first 3 of these 4 persecutions were all very Wu-themed.
Woohoo!
Well, not quite woohoo. No, not for the Buddhists. So
no, certainly not.
No, definitely not. So let's talk about the persecution itself.
Please.
And this first persecution was a particularly bloody one. So Taiwu ordered for the complete ban of Buddhism. Following Buddhism was actually punishable by death at this point. That dealt a massive blow to people becoming Buddhists. People weren't going to be like, hey, I'm going to become a Buddhist now, because they were going to be killed if that happened. Like, that stopped people who wanted to become Buddhists. But what about people already following the practice? Many of them were met with a particularly bloody end. And the rebel who kicked this all off, that aforementioned Gai Wu, he was situated in the Ganzhong region of China. Taiwu ordered that all Buddhists in this region be slaughtered, killed. If you were Buddhist in that region, to teach Gai Wu and all the other Buddhists a lesson, he killed them all. So he didn't kill every Buddhist in his empire, just every Buddhist in this specific region. And of course, the destruction of Buddhism stretched out beyond this reason. Buddhist monks across his empire were killed. Buddhist temples, statues, and scriptures were all destroyed. Anything Buddhism related got the axe. So it was a pretty intense persecution, this first one.
Well, you know, this is interesting because you could definitely look at all of this and say to yourself quite reasonably, does that seem like a tad overkill for just finding some weapons in a temple?
Yeah, like if it is a setup, which we're completely hypothesizing, at least do a bigger setup to justify this kind of level of persecution.
What I would say about that is that realistically, it's a question worth asking because it's something that has occurred so often in history. And just in terms of the justification that starts the persecution.
It does, yeah, it feels strange. But then you could argue that World War I kicked off because of a sandwich, as people like to argue. Things in history can get out of hands at time.
Let's not open the World War I can of beans at the moment.
Let's not mention that.
No, that's a tangent waiting to happen.
No,
but
totally.
The other thing I find so incredible about this, Patrick, is because naturally it had been a part of Chinese civilization at this point for almost 4 centuries. And the thing that I find so interesting is that they managed to get so many people on board with this persecution. After all this time, you'd figure if you had grown up with it and it was just basically a way of life for you, that you wouldn't have the same zeal to go out and go after, say, your Buddhist neighbor or your local Buddhist monk. So I find that
It is,
absolutely
yeah.
fascinating. There must have been more to this. There must have been something that the population was also kind of grinding an axe about, but I'd be very curious to know.
Yeah, I wish obviously this is so far back. It can be hard to figure out what exactly happened and what we have recorded documentation. But yeah, there must have been something else going on because Buddhism had been around for a great deal of time in China. But it's weird. The kind of thought process my mind went on is it all basically came down to this prime minister, Su Hao. He was a devout Taoist. For one reason or another, he didn't like Buddhism. He liked Taoism. And it only takes, and he has such influence over the emperor who can make these sort of decisions. It takes just one person with one specific ideology to be in the right position of power to kick this off. And maybe it was just a case of that. You have this one guy with a bee in his bonnet about Buddhism, and he ended up in the right place to do something about it. That's kind of a thought process I went down with this.
So here's the kind of an interesting thing in terms of in terms of orchestrating any sort of political campaign. There's a lot of theories out there that discuss how you actually convince people to do something. And there's this particular school of thought that says you never actually change people's minds, but what somebody does is that's trying to whip up support is they go in front of a group of people that have already on their own kind of gone down the same line of thinking, but you take them and you say, you know, you may have noticed this as well, but guess what? It's worse. And we need to then now do X, Y, and Z, the more extreme step.
That's interesting.
It is an interesting theory, and one that unfortunately I have good reason, quite cynically, to believe. Because it is very hard to change people's minds.
Oh, totally.
And in this case, if they're already some way down the road of the place you're looking to take them, that sure makes it a lot easier. And sometimes it may be the only way.
Yeah, okay.
So that's a part of this I'd be very curious about.
Okay, that is interesting. No, there's definitely an interesting school of thought there. But I'd like to say, unfortunately, we're not too clued up on it. All we seem to know is the fact that Taiwu got his way and that began these persecution. But you're right, you think there would be more retaliation against there. But I guess if you're dealing with someone of such absolute power, that might be a factor as well. You can't fight against it. The emperor doesn't want Buddhism anymore, so they're going to sort out something about it.
Apparently so. I mean, the emperor in this period and before and long after was truly an autocrat, even if they're putting somebody else that they choose to handle the day-to-day business of ruling.
And I think that's something I want to say about my whole theory. It just takes one person to be in the right place. Being an autocracy, being an absolute monarchy helps that as well, because there isn't like a government you have to go through. There's a democratic system in place. You just need to influence that one person to have your agenda, and you're off to the races. But let's talk about the end of this persecution, because while this persecution was intense, it actually didn't last that long. In the years following this, the ban Taiwu put on Buddhism actually eased off a tad. It wasn't as intense. And in 452 AD, Taiwu actually died. And his son took over, but not for that long. We don't really need to worry about him. Who we do care more about is Taiwu's grandson, who was called Wensheng, and he took over shortly. And Wensheng was a devout Buddhist, which makes things easier, meaning he wasn't actually too impressed by his grandfather's ban. And I found this so bizarre. Like, you've done this absolute ban on Buddhism, but your own grandchild is still carrying it out. I'd love to know more about the story behind that. Was this grandchild Buddhist in secret, or was he openly against his grandfather while he was emperor? I have no idea, but that seemed very strange.
Privilege of power.
Yes,
my
of
interesting
course.
Friend.
Privilege of power.
Privilege of power. And, you know, this is one of those things that, once again, we see a lot in history sometimes when you have this very public campaign or this very public belief led by somebody, but you get into their personal life and you don't have to go that far, and you realize that they're operating in supreme hypocrisy.
Yes, yeah, that's a great explanation for that. I was wondering, why would that be the case? But that explains it all. So yeah, when Wensheng, his grandson, took over in 452 AD, He, unsurprisingly, being a devout Buddhist, promptly ended this ban on Buddhism. And that meant that this persecution ran from about 446 to 452, so roughly 6 years. And while this might be the first time Chinese Buddhists had experienced persecution, it unfortunately,
at least on this scale.
Yeah, at least on this scale, it definitely will not be the last time.
No, it definitely won't. And just in case I missed it, what happened to his grandfather's prime minister?
I didn't figure out this full story, but he was actually assassinated by Taiwu a couple years before Taiwu died. I don't know the full story on that. That wasn't a trail I decided to follow in research because it was a bit far away from the persecution. But I believe he actually ended up being killed himself in some bizarre scenario.
I wonder what it was that kicked off that decision.
But yeah, it's just it reminds me a bit of something we talked about a while back. That Roman emperor who's sort of seen as one of the worst, the guy who gave Britain back to Rome, the guy who freed Britain from Rome.
So was that under Honorius?
Honorius, yeah. Do you remember he had like a general who everyone really adored, who he eventually ended up ordering his death as well?
Yes.
Yeah. In 450 AD, over reasons that are not completely clear to this day, Emperor Taiwu had Su and his cadet branch executed. So we don't know why. The 9 familial exterminations, which is another event in Chinese history with a number in its name.
It just keeps popping up.
It just keeps getting deeper and deeper.
This seems like we're actually seeing the birth of a Name Explain episode right before our eyes.
Potentially. The numbered historical events of China. No, maybe at some point. But
I mean, granted, it's a little niche, but
oh no, I've done niche.
But it's one of those things that is definitely worthy of investigation should you choose to do so.
Yeah, totally. It's fascinating how this pops up so often. Clearly, like numbering things was an important factor in ancient China. But that just wraps up this first persecution in Chinese Buddhist history on a mass scale. And there are more coming, Paul. Don't you worry. I know how much you love a persecution. There's going to be some more coming your way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is going to be good.
Yeah. So the next one.
What do we have to... Yeah, let's see. What do we have to look forward to?
So there's actually quite a large chunk of time between them all. So the second Wu disaster was in the 6th century. And the third one was the 9th century. And the fourth and final Buddhist persecution, which wasn't Wu related, is the 10th century. So over the next few seasons of AD history, we'll be picking up this thread.
Well, I'm sure glad that I was not Buddhist in that time and that place. At least as far as I know. Incredible stuff, Patrick. Is that what you have for us today?
That is, yeah, what I have for us today. It's exciting stuff. It's cool to research into China again. As you guys know by now, I have got a bit of a deep interest in following this sort of Chinese history, this trail of this fascinating country ending up where it is now. It's nice to escape Rome and the carnage in Rome for a little bit, just for now anyway. But you're going to be picking up that carnage. You're in the thick of it, Paul.
I am absolutely in the thick of it. And you know what? The other thing I like is that throughout this series, and I mean that series in the American way, not in the British way, where we're talking about seasons of a show, you've definitely developed a distinct interest in following up the various religious threads historically.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool.
I find the history of religion very fascinating, more so than the actual fundamentals of religion itself. How religions, because it's very human history, religious history. It's got this very human element of just figuring out, understanding how the world works and how we sort of put ourselves into places. I find that deeply fascinating.
I mean, from a sociological standpoint, to understand religion is to understand a great deal of the human equation.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just fascinating seeing how we came to these places, because we so often think of religions as just these concrete things, and they have always just been the way they are. And we see of Christianity in our heads, we think, well, there's Christianity, there's all the different kinds of sects of it. You got your Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, that's the word, completely left my brain. and that's just how it is. And that, of course, wasn't just how it is. To get to that point took hundreds of years of separation and creation.
Thousands of
years to get to that point. And I find that
with the
really
exception of
fascinating.
Protestantism, but
No, yeah, that kind of happened kind of a bit abruptly. But it's really interesting stuff, and I really enjoyed researching that history of the religions.
well, it's always a treat when you do it, my friend.
Thank you.
And us here, well, thank you. Us here, you there, and we'll be back right after a word from 1 AD.
This is the AD History Podcast. Keep up with the show and join the discussion by following AD History on Twitter with the handle @ADHistoryPC and the hashtag ADHistory. Check us out over on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube by searching AD History Podcast, as well as, of course, tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. Also, check out the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See how you can help support the show and the rewards that await you by exploring the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See the link in the description. Now, back to Paul and Patrick. This is the AD History Podcast. And this is not what you're used to. This is my actual voice. I sound like a gremlin. No, I don't.
Anything but.
Yeah. So
So, to you listening right now, for the first time, this is indeed the one you have come to know as Anna Domini.
Brrr, that's my round of applause or drum roll. That's me. Hello.
Yes.
hello, Anna.
This is her joining us for the first time live, well, at least live at the time of recording. And we could not be any happier to be here. And the fact of the matter is, the show is now over 50 episodes old. And we wanted to find, Patrick and I wanted to find a good occasion to do something to mark the occasion, because it's a lot of episodes. Plenty to come, but a lot, plenty that we've done so far.
It's been a long old time we've been doing it as well, it feels like. We've somehow done this through a pandemic and an economical crisis, and it's only been a few years.
It is amazing all the
That's
history
mad.
that's happening around us as we
A
cover.
lot of history that's happened during this history podcast.
So
Yes.
the best place to start here is how, because this is the important part if we're going to start anywhere, the beginning. How did you two meet?
So I don't know if we've properly introduced Anna yet, Paul.
Oh,
My name is Anna. I'm a Pisces.
I don't
I'm
know
a
what that...
British female voiceover artist.
Yes.
No, yes, my name actually is Anna. It's not just Anna Domini.
And
but
that's one of the reasons it works so well, because your name was already Anna.
I know, it was meant to be. So yes, my name is Anna Chloe Morey as a full name. And yes, so that's about me.
Yeah. So I think, sorry, Anna, you're going to say something?
I was going to say, segueing back into what was highlighted at or hinted at before, we knew each other from a past life.
Yeah, and that's the best way to explain it. It was a past life.
It was a past life.
Yeah, and so we went to college together, which for listeners in America or outside the UK,
A
college.
bit like community college or end of high school-ish.
Yeah, here you kind of do college between high school and university. I did a year there because I needed extra credit, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I met all kinds of wonderful people there. And I met yourself there. I think we had a mutual friend because you weren't in any of my classes. We weren't in any classes together in college. I think
But
it was
you were
Sam.
in the same social group.
Yeah.
Was it Sam? I wouldn't be surprised. if
Sam
it
was a
Sam.
social butterfly, wherever he may be now. But
Yes.
Sam, I think I met via Sam in between your friendship group, my friendship group, through Sam sort of in the middle. And I barely talk to anyone from uni, from college anymore these days. But I always kept in touch with yourself, I think through Twitter, through Facebook, through Instagram. Like, I was always like, I need to keep Anna somewhere because she's a really interesting person and she might come in handy one day.
That's what people always say about them. Where they just say, Anna, you're so interesting. I've got to keep you on some kind of speed dial.
Got to keep you on some sort of, keep you on tab for something.
Yeah. Oh, that's very nice compliment. Thank you. That's very kind.
And
but
then,
yes.
Yes, what you were saying.
I don't know. But I guess from my side of the story was, so after college, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit. After college or during college, I started my own YouTube channel, and I was doing stuff on YouTube.
Yeah.
Which was, I'm not ashamed to say this, was My Little Pony voice impressions.
Yes.
And I do have a video with 6 million views. Thank you very much.
Cheers to that. That's a real accomplishment.
I don't have that.
I'll take that. I'll definitely take that. And you know what? It is a My Little Pony Frozen crossover I made when I was, 16, 17.
Oh, boy.
But I tell you what, I'm very proud of it because I can see on YouTube there are videos of children playing with the toys, listening to the song.
That is so
sweet.
Cool.
I know.
So
it's nice to feel like I made an impact in that way. And so that's how I started doing videos of impressions and things like that. And then I guess at the same time, towards when I was midway through my, I can't think of the right word. I'm doing like little quotation What's that?
Quotation.
Quotation.
Oh, air quotes.
Yeah.
Air quotes. In air quotes, my YouTube career. That's what I was trying to do. That I saw that Patrick was making videos, and I was like, oh my goodness. It took me a little bit by surprise, but you were very good at them. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And then I saw you wrote a book, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is crazy town.
It's weird. It's a weird little life we've both ended up in. But then you kind of, you were always into acting. I remember when we were at college, you were doing drama. I think I saw one of your performances at one point.
Oh no, which one was it?
I can't
was it the one where I was
remember.
pretending to be a man and just swearing?
I don't think so, no. I think it was something to do with purgatory or death or something. It was textbook college like.
Oh yes,
textbook.
I think I remember the one. Or maybe you saw my script work where I had to look into my friend Zoe's eyes and say that this is so so drama. It's so theatre. I had to look into her eyes and pretend that my character was really vain and that they wanted to see her. She wanted to see her own reflection in the eyes of the person she was looking at, because in this purgatory to hell, there was no mirrors. So that I remember that. Yes.
That is ringing a bell. Yeah. So
I think that's
that would be
it.
hell for the narcissist, wouldn't it? For the terribly vain.
Yeah. I think the line was something like, have you a glass? I'll look at the glass in your eyes, or something like that. Oh, goodness.
Gosh. But
goodness gracious.
From
that is very theatre.
But
yes.
When I knew yourself, you weren't particularly in the voice work. When did the voice work come into play?
I guess following from my stint as a My Little Pony impressionist, it really did develop from. I'd always growing up also do impressions of voices that I heard on TV. So I would always listen to India Fisher from MasterChef for those UK fans out there. So it would be like, Paul has prepared a grilled sea bass with.
You should really try my grilled sea bass sometime.
Yeah,
I assure you that is no overstatement.
With dauphinoise potatoes, something like that. And so I grew up on that voice and just hearing voices in commercials, and I always thought it was something I was quite interested in. And then, because I've always been a bit of a mimic as well, which I've had to kind of fight against a little bit actually, but it helps me with characters, because then I sometimes will base it off something that I've heard or a person that I like or find funny or something like that, and then that will be a starting point to then build on into a different character. But the voice work came because people first said, can you voice one of these impressions for animation I'm doing? And then I created relationships with those creators of animations and video games.
Yeah.
Well, video games came later, actually, but the animations that they would say, oh no, can you voice this original character? Then I made some voice reels, and then I got a couple video game jobs, and then I got an agent. And
fantastic.
then, yeah, and then I got some, then I was in Warhammer, which was probably my biggest, most
nice.
notable.
That's a big deal.
Yeah,
Warhammer's
my most
hugely
notable
popular.
credit to date, I could say. And yeah, so I play a little spell weaver in the DLC of, I think it's the Twisted and the Twilight. So I'm this wood elf, like, spell weaver ready, and I'm making my spells, and it was all very floaty and all that stuff. It was a really fun, that was mid-pandemic as well, so I'm still on my voiceover journey. I have to keep reminding myself, I have done quite a lot, but I'm sure
totally.
anyone who's like in it when they're doing something, when you're in it and you're doing it quite regularly, it's very easy to forget or put yourself down or try and be a bit more humble.
I can barely, like, when it comes to my like name explain side of things, I can barely, like, I'm like, did I make that video? Like, half the videos on my channel, I couldn't tell you what they're about or like what the content of them is. I have minimal recollection of making. A lot of them, like, after a year or so, I go back and watch it, and I can just watch it as like a view and be like, oh, it's actually quite fun. I get why people like this, because I'm making it, this is awful. But
it's
actually,
funny, isn't it? It's that little period of time.
Yeah,
I get that.
It's not.
You get like the week of making it, and I'm like, oh, this is great. Then up to a month to like 3 months later, terrible, hate it, don't want to watch it.
Oh, that is the life of a creator right there.
Yeah.
Then it gets some longevity with time. Then you know, you quite enjoy it.
Oh, that's quite nice. So you were off doing your voice work, and I sort of kept tabs on you. And then just when me and Paul were talking about making AD history a thing, one of the very first things we decided on was we wanted, because you're a big fan of like the BBC radio production form and having the sort of the call to, not the call to action, how on radio you do have, this is BBC Radio 2, that sort of thing, like, and you wanted that element,
presenter voice
but a separate voice from the presenters.
Yes, but it was not early on, actually. It really actually came later than you would think, Patrick. It came
was here from episode 1, wasn't she? Or am I making that up?
No, she was, but you and I, independently, it's interesting, came to the idea of, hey, you know what? We're doing this thing. We're doing it seriously. You know, we are handling this in as professional a manner as we're capable of based on our resources and our experience at this point. And we both kind of independently at the same time, I want to say it was in late May of early June. So the show officially launches around mid-August of 2019. So this is late May, early June of 2019. But you beat me to the punch and you mentioned it. And that you also mentioned that you have someone in mind. And it just so happens that you sent me a link to your professional page, Anna. And I heard you do some of your work. And instantly, I knew this was the person we needed to hire.
Oh, that's very sweet.
Well, I appreciate that, but thank you. But it was one of those things where there was so much about it that made sense. First off, the quality was very high. 2, I really liked the idea that the voice would be female as a contrast to Patrick and myself.
Totally.
And also knowing that the half of our audience would invariably be American, there is a lot to be said about how American audiences react to a British accent. And in many cases, I know when it comes to the British, you guys are your ears are very well attuned to where in the country the accent comes from. For Americans, we do not have that filter. You know, you can be RP like Anna, or you
classic
can
RP.
Yeah. And
you have got a resoundingly classic RP, Anna. I think that's one of the main reasons. Like, Americans want to hear a good British accent, and if I'm the one supplying that accent, they're disappointed. So you need to give them an actual proper British accent as well, because I don't know what mess it is that comes out of my mouth, but it ain't that.
Or it can be an accent that comes from quote unquote the North, and our reactions will be very similar to that. However, especially since my co-host is a Briton, and I had a decent idea of being able to distinguish where some accents come from, but I know RP when I hear it. At least I think I do. And in your case, it was just a perfect match to what we were looking to do.
Oh, it's lovely to hear. I'll always take the compliment, and but no, it's yes, I am very RP, I have to say, and but I'm not heightened RP. I think my natural, even though I said that quite poshly, I've learned how to do a heightened RP, which is more like the Queen's English.
Yes,
but yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. I just started talking about RP accents. I've learned a lot about accents recently. It's all on my mind.
When you get work, is it more or less them wanting an RP type voice, or do they ever demand, like, do they always want British? Do they ever ask anything else out of you?
Oh, that's a very interesting question.
That's a really good question.
So,
surely if you're hiring yourself, they want, so if they want an American accent, they could hire an American or something.
Well, funnily enough, I would say at least it used to be more, but then I cut down because I want to try and, market my natural sound more. But probably still today, about 40% of the work I do is with an American accent.
How interesting.
No kidding. Let's hear it.
Yes, please.
Yeah, let's put
all
it
right,
on the spot.
I gotta drop into it. Okay.
So what I want to know
pressure.
is, Anna, do you know what specific?
That's actually really good.
Do you know what specific American accent you're doing, Anna?
Well, this is general American.
Yeah, you can hear that straight out of the Midwest.
Yeah, so
Midwest, interesting.
Midwest. I think I go a little bit Midwest and sometimes a little bit Canadian, but I don't know.
Yeah, so that's the upper Midwest. If you're talking about northern Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota,
Minnesota. And we were doing accents in class on Monday. And we were doing our Southern. I've had to voice a Southern character-ish. It was kind of lightly influenced by Southern. One of my favorite roles was Joy in an animation called Sheriff Hayseed in a short called Boomerang in a Gunfight on Pymation's channel. And that character is called Mayor Joy. She just has like a massive... She's very angry, which is very fun to play. But she had a voice like this, and she really wanted to get business done. And that kind of, I don't have time for any of your shenanigans. Something like that. And, yeah. And then I like to do my Barbra Streisand impression as well sometimes. But, you know.
Boy. Is that just spoken word or when she's belting one out?
Not quite belting one out. If I could belt one out like Barbra Streisand, I wouldn't stop.
Fair enough.
But it's like when she's talking about doing stuff and being at places, and I need to think of something she says.
Yeah, just that phrase that really keys you in.
Yeah,
what
is it?
York.
New York.
Sort of textbook.
If I had a bagel and a plate of onion rolls, you gotta get into it like that. It's gotta be around here.
If you take your ERs and turn them into A's and your A's into ERs.
Okay. Interesting. My A's in an AR.
It's a little hard to do on the fly.
Yeah, it's like no, I can only get into country now. This is accent 101 now. This is no longer the AD history podcast. This is accent 101.
No, this is indeed the AD
right.
history podcast. Anna Domini all the way.
The three key voices of AD history talking
Anna Domini.
on air.
Anna Domini.
Anna Domini.
Here. Anna Domini. Anna Domini.
Now, but in terms of work you've done, you've also done reading for The Economist.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do some more work for them over Christmas, which is good. I haven't for a while because I've been full-time at my school. I'm currently taking a musical theatre course for a year, which is very exciting, hence why I did accent class the other day. Still learning.
I definitely want to get to that in a moment, but what exactly, what kind of reads do you do for The Economist?
So for The Economist, I do the headlines. So for every article in The Economist, there's about 2 or 3 headlines just saying what it's about. And in a voice quite similar to the voice I actually use for the AD History podcast. I'll do something like, what's a market research? Like, that's usually one that comes up. How big pharma is like, I'm just trying to make up an Economist headline off the top of my head. How big pharma will tackle the new financial period.
That's certainly AD to a T.
Yeah. So
it's very that.
What would they be used for? Would they be used for like their video versions of their podcast?
The audio edition. So
okay.
the subscription paid audio edition. I don't think I'm on the podcast one because they do a free podcast every week, which is just the main headlines. And then I'm in the like subscription audio. So if you listen to The Economist and it's a UK voice, not recently, but if you listen over Christmas, it will most likely be me. So
fantastic.
Yes,
so
you'll hear me at the start of every article just kind of explaining what's about to happen.
Have you like ever been caught off guard by something you've done? Because obviously like a lot of your work, I mean, the audio footage we use for you is years old now.
Yes,
but we're still using
other than what we recorded a month ago.
Yes, of course. There's some exciting new recordings coming up.
I have a great story.
By all means.
Yeah.
Great
Have you ever been sort of like doing something like, wait, I know that voice. That's me. Has that anything like that ever happened for you?
Yes, I have. And it happened without me saying any words. I recognized my own scream.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
So in the original run of Raid Shadow Legends ads.
Oh boy.
The ones that were
Raid
in the
Shadow
channels.
Legends.
And I didn't realize it was for Raid. So this is, I got it on Upwork back in the day. And they wanted a voice for a video game. So I did it. And I didn't hear back anything. And then I was watching the Philip DeFranco show, if anyone is familiar. And there was a Raid, mid-roll ad. And I heard this scream. And I was like, that scream sounds a lot like me. Because I have a very distinctive scream. When I record screams, I know when I scream. Yeah. It's got like this quality to it. That was not a full-out scream, but it has this kind of wobble to it. And so it's very distinctive, and I can find the clip and send it to you for you to input this scream.
Yeah, that would actually be a real thrill.
But yeah, and then I contacted the company because I was like, this is my scream. And they were like, no, it isn't. And so I went back and I found the audio file that I recorded, which is exactly the same. And I said, this is my scream. And then I think it stopped being used in the ads because they realized they couldn't do it anymore. But it's still alive on, I think, a couple of videos still of the original run. I think one of the first runs of the Raid Shadow Legends ads.
So how would they have ended up getting their hands on that scream if they shouldn't have had it then?
Well, what happened was, so I recorded for the character, and then what happened after that was what did I do? I recorded for the character. I'm having a bit of a mind fuck. You might need to cut this bit.
That's okay. No,
go good.
That's what we're here for. The whole point of this segment is to sort of show that you're more than just
a disembodied voice
that says a few select lines like Buzz Lightyear, an actual functioning human.
About? Okay, good. I recorded for this character, and in that recording line pack was a scream. So it was a few lines and a scream. And so I sent that off. But when they re-recorded all the characters, they recast everyone because they wanted, I think, a higher budget. But when they re-recorded everyone, they didn't put the new scream in. They kept the old scream in. So that's how it got through, really.
Okay.
But it's 100% my scream.
Now, something as far as you listening to this conversation right now, perhaps out there somewhere in our audience, there's somebody that has thought about the going into voiceover, whether it be as a part-time profession or maybe it's something they seriously aspire to, what is it like working in voiceover? How competitive is it? What are some things that an aspiring voiceover actor should know, in your opinion, if they want to break into the business?
I would say it's all about quality and connections, because you can do as much and also practice. I would say that as well. I was going to say you can do as much practice as you want, but ultimately you're going to be hindered if you aren't networking, or you aren't finding the sites to actually get the work, or you're not finding places well, even where you can talk with other voiceover artists. It doesn't necessarily have to be networking with businesses, but just not treating everyone as competition, really. I think that actually is quite good, because then you have people who you know who can do voices that you can't, and it's being aware of what your unique selling point is and the things you can do and the things you can't. I'm someone who at the moment, and probably I don't see that changing, I'm not, hilariously, quite ironically, I'm not a big screamer. I'll record a couple screams, but there are people who really love video games and they really want to do like all the zombie sounds and all the monster sounds. And that's not me. I would struggle in that environment. And there are people who are, and if you're someone like who does that, I say great. Make sure you're doing it safely, obviously. But
of course,
there are certain things that when you know your voice can do it and your voice can withstand it healthily, or you know that you're not going to get tired out, because it's all well and good saying like, I can do this voice and I'm going to speak in this voice for 4 hours. And then towards the end of the session, you're a bit like this, you know?
Yeah.
Because you can't speak, you know, it's about having stamina in what you can do with your voice. And so that's about, I guess, the performance and networking side of it. And then quality is just making sure that you can, have something. It doesn't have to be crazy expensive, but something that you know creates a good sound, that's clear. And the more versed you're in audio editing will aid you, but it's not a requirement. You'll become familiar with certain things as you go along. I don't consider myself an audio editor by any means. I can edit my audio if need be, but I don't like doing it.
No.
And there are people out there who are voiceover artists who I know who are amazing. And one person I know in particular produces reels, and he's just really, really good at that. So yeah, just finding your strengths, and I guess that plays into USP as well, your unique selling point. That's what I'd say.
Now,
and don't lose the fun of it as well, because
No.
a lot of stuff is really fun.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, you briefly mentioned gear, and right now you are, as I recall, you're using a Focusrite interface. You're using you're using an Aston condenser mic.
Yes.
What are you using in terms of cans? And by cans, for those in the audience that aren't familiar, that's headphones. What are some of your suggestions?
And look at them. They are I've got the AKG headphones. I've got some of these, but they aren't necessarily what I would recommend. I think they're fine. You just want something as neutral as possible for voiceover. You don't want anything that's too bass boosting. So as neutral as you can be on the EQ side.
Not consumer grade headphones where you have that V shape.
No, yeah. But something that's gonna not have too much bass. Headphones just love bass boosts, don't they?
Well,
just like,
the human ear
bass?
is very drawn to the bass.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess with a lot of music, like people want that big loud bass, because most people buy headphones for music reasons, for listening to music. I guess we're not doing that as much. Something I'm curious to ask about is, you said about USP. Have you noticed having a British accent gets you quite far in internet land? Because like on YouTube, people love like
it's
the
funny.
British
I was asking you the
accent.
same question when we were doing the voiceover about a month ago.
I don't really know. I remember that one of my first. I've also had quite a few training sessions as well, which has also been helpful, which is something I'd recommend as well. But one of my first ever tutoring or something like one-to-one sessions I had, the guy said, "Oh, you should sell diamonds." It's that kind of voice. But
how straight, yeah.
It's a really I haven't noticed it too much actually, because most of the YouTube work I do is American accents, but I feel that might be because of just the context I have still, who know me for being able to do characters in an American accent, and then the Britishness doesn't quite come out. I think the most recent thing I had to do with a British accent, but not really a British accent, was for Mashed, an animation channel on YouTube.
I know Mashed, yeah.
Oh, do you know Mashed?
I know they do like the pixel art sort of stuff. Am I imagining that? Or do they do pixel art sort of stuff?
Oh, no, they
I've
do
heard the
animated comedy thingy-mabobbies.
Okay.
And thingy-mabobbies. I love you, Mashed. Sorry, I'm not trying to... and I had to do a Love Island Animal Crossing parody. So
Fantastic.
That was a very different type of English accent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get it for ads and things. I've had quite a few corporate jobs, which is mainly where my RP has come into play, and some characters.
That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, so I've done a few corporate, like, our financial situation. They like me for finances, basically. Whenever we're talking about money.
I can understand the appeal there because they're looking for an authoritative voice. Now, and you mentioned that you're doing a year-long theater course right now.
Yes, I am indeed. I am.
What is your aspiration going forward, whether it be voiceover or just in the performing arts in general? Because this seems to be very much along the track that you're working. What are you aspiring to right now?
I think at the moment I'm aspiring to extend the opportunities that I can be seen for and that I could get. And that's things like being able to audition for musicals or plays that are in the West End or touring across England. And then also it just gives me more opportunities in the acting side of things if I've got training. And also I'm getting training, which has been amazing. It's been very difficult in the sense of coming from not having professional experience and then being a student again. Because I haven't been a student since I was at college with Patrick.
Yeah.
So since I was 19. So I've had 6 years not in school. So it's been really interesting going back into it's not, an educational, it's not as by the book as what most universities might be like. But we have classes and we have a lot of assignments, and it's been a real challenge going back and managing that. I had a funny moment a few weeks ago where we had a audition kind of thing, and it was for our end of show for this term that we're in now. So we're about to do the show in a couple of weeks. And he asked, can you tell us something, like 2 things interesting about yourself? And I just completely blanked. I couldn't think of anything. And it's funny, isn't it? You just have to always remember the core of who you are, often, I find. And it's hard. It's hard to do that.
That's quite profound.
Yeah, it's really hard. And then after that, I was like, I forgot all this stuff I've done. Why couldn't I remember it in that
On
moment?
the spot.
Yeah, it was really bizarre. I was like, I've done a thing for the BBC. Why couldn't I remember that now?
Not to put you on the spot here, but say we're talking like bigger picture, like truly long term. And I understand this could be a little bit embarrassing if I were asked the question, but if there's something that's really big that you'd love to say at the end of the day, you look back in your career and you say, wow, that's really something amazing that I did. What do you think that thing might be for you going forward?
Ooh, that's a very difficult question. And I feel like I'm in 2 camps, because there are certain things in my mind that I'm like, oh yes, definitely that would be lovely. and then it's almost like, oh, I don't want to jinx it. I don't want to say
Of
it
course,
because it
of
might
course.
not happen.
Something you care about so much, you dare
Oh,
not even
100%.
speak it. Yes.
I can say that my dream for a long time, above anything else, and it's still my dream, is to be a voice in an animated kids TV show on TV in the UK. So that's been my dream for number one. If I can sing a song while doing it, great. Hey, I've got the musical theatre training to do it.
Yeah.
Is voice the 4 and 4 like voice acting is still the top priority for yourself?
I think it was my first love when it came to acting. And funnily enough, my acting teacher said to me quite recently, she said, it's almost as if you can't quite move forward. It's almost like you've been acting in a box. It's like, really?
Well, yeah, that makes sense with the voice acting. Yeah, literally a booth.
Literally
How
a booth.
Fascinating.
I know, it's funny that was in the body as well. So, but that is, voiceover has been was one of my first loves of just listening to voices and animation. And it was always something I was interested in doing. And then the fact that it has turned this corner to that could actually happen for me is very exciting.
Oh,
But
it sounds like
there
it's
is-
on the horizon, sure.
Yeah. So I hope that can happen for me. That is still my number one dream. I think I'm like excited about the prospect of being an actor and being in shows and things. But I think to name a particular project at this time would be I wish there was I bet there's a beautiful word out there that would perfectly describe it in just one word, but it would feel a little like I'm expecting it too much. I tell you what, if for the people listening out there, we're going to play a little dictionary game. You can comment the word and then I'll learn a new word.
Well, I can definitely tell you, Anna, that your contribution to AD history, when you did this job for the first time 3.5 years ago and you laid down the initial voice work, I remember saying in an email to you right when we were wrapping it up and we were moving our separate ways is that, one way or another now, this is a job for you, but at the same time, you're very much also attached at the hip in its own way. And
the
we're
third voice.
Yes, and we're very fortunate that the show has enjoyed the success that it has and that people have heard you the world over through the medium of AD history, and that AD history would not be AD history if not for you being the voice of it. You really do bring, you really are part of that tapestry that brings it all together, serves as that audio glue in a way that really helps create, for all intents and purposes, our unique sound. It just would not be the same show without you, and we could not be more fortunate that Patrick met you all those years ago in college, and that this opportunity arose as it did, because working with you has been fantastic.
We were talking, Paul, I think you guys told us before we started recording about me and Anna, the last time we saw each other in the flesh when we were like 17, 19 years old, like literally so young, and like watching Frozen at your house.
Babies.
It's so strange. actual babies, like almost 10 years ago or so now. It's just bizarre how life works. It's very, very strange. But what I also want to say is to the audience, if you happen, I'm going to look at the camera here, if you happen to be looking for a female RP or American accent voice for your kids' TV show, for your podcast yourself, for any voice work you might need, Anna, where can people find you?
You can go on my website, which is annachloemori.com, or you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at AnnaChloe like the cow. And that's I think that's where you can find me. Those were my main hangouts. That's very nice. I think this is like the first. I think I was saying to Paul when we were recording a new session of things, which I don't know. Can I talk about that? Or
absolutely,
is that
it's already come through.
I was going to say top secret. You don't know what's coming. But I was talking to Paul about the fact that I think this is the first project where I've had a community in the sense where people have been, interested or intrigued about in this way, or
Yes,
where it's felt
absolutely.
as continual as this, or where I felt like
Yeah.
my contributions have been ongoing, even though I haven't said any more things.
No, totally.
So
It's been,
it's really interesting. So
Yeah.
I've loved the experience, and it's been really nice to reconnect with you guys.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure
since-
being able to speak
since
and work
then.
with you.
Yeah. And that was
Yeah.
so much part of what we wanted. We wanted it to be, we wanted that sort of BBC style voiceover. We wanted it to be like a bit of a Anna Domini, who said, to be something of a character. How much can we do with probably no more than 5 minutes worth of audio content we've got from you? Probably about 10 minutes now after this new recording stuff.
Yeah.
How can we personify that and make it into a breathing part of the show as much as possible? And it seems like hopefully we've succeeded with that, I guess.
Any communication that I've had with listeners of the show, because we get a fair number of emails, so many of them include some kind of reference to you. And it definitely speaks to, as well as on YouTube as well. But in terms of the folks that I've had the pleasure of communicating with, corresponding with one-on-one, they always make reference to you. And that always makes my heart sing, because that really, that's exactly what we had hoped. Because
we always make reference to you, we always say, and thank you, Anna. As we perform it as if you're actually there doing it live with us. That's part of how we do it. It's part of the performance we do. It really is we wanted to make it a proper breathing, livable part of the podcast, like the third voice.
Anna Domini is a character.
Yeah, it's a character. Yeah, and here's the real Anna. Coincidentally, the person who plays Anna Domini is also called Anna. It kind of worked together to bring this full circle.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. And
thank you very much, Anna.
Us here, you there, and we'll be back after a word from me. Shh. Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast.
Okay, so Paul, we're back with yourself again, and you're once again talking to us about Attila the Hun. I'm curious to know, how much more of this story we've got to cover, because it's been fascinating so far.
After today, there is one more installation. This man's life is extremely dense, and there's a reason why he is such a mammoth figure in history, especially the history that we are covering right now. And in this particular decade is where Attila's name is genuinely made to history. Not only does he reach the pinnacle of power by himself, but it is also where a great deal of his more ruthless reputation is established. No doubt, it was a combination of circumstance, ambition, and what is otherwise a harrowing trail of conquest, if you can even call them that. In 441, much was up in the air with the Hunnic ruling brothers, each with their respective kingdoms and their persistent rivals of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. Because remember, when Bleda and Attila inherited power from their uncle Rua, they did not become co-rulers as it had been the case with other Hun kings before them. They actually split the kingdom, and they were two separate kingdoms that they ruled separately. But in 440 and 441, the Eastern Roman Empire had bigger fish to fry, at least for a time. Somewhat fortuitously for the Hunnic powers, because the Sassanid Persians invaded Armenia in 440 and 441 under the direction of Yazdegerd II.
So that's fascinating to hear, Paul, because slight spoiler for our upcoming episode next week. This ain't the last time the Sassanids are going to invade Armenia, and I don't think it's probably the first either. It's fascinating to hear Armenia is already coming into play here.
Armenia never seems to be out of play when it comes to Roman power, whether it be a joint Roman Empire or the Eastern Empire that's becoming the Byzantines. They are they're in this constant tug of war when it comes to these powers, whether it's the Sassanid Persians or it's the Parthians before them. There's no question that certainly within the scope of this show, they're constantly in the crosshairs of both. It really feels like since time immemorial, for that matter. And they're both, Armenia is always a client state. The question is, who is their client?
Yes, yeah.
And which client are they going to be serving?
Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's another, and sometimes it's both. And sometimes sometimes it's no one. Yeah, every now and then it is no one. They are their own client. But
yeah,
from what I've looked into Armenia, and we'll talk more about them in the next episode, absolutely fascinating point in this part of history. And like I said, it all comes down to that geographic location. It's so, like you said, on the crosshairs of not even Eastern Rome, but also the Sassanids as well. It's in that it's the Caucasus region. It's in just that real particular region, which is just so on the cusp of everything and literally caught in the middle.
It is interesting because the way this particular arrangement works between Roman power, Byzantine power, Sassanid, Parthian, whatever the case is, certainly in this case, is that they have almost this policy where only one of the two of them is allowed to have at Armenia, and that they jointly will go out of their way to make sure outsiders outside of the two of them are not allowed.
Yeah, it's hey, this is our problem.
Yeah, it's like only we're allowed to pick on you.
Everyone else. It's kind of like, when you're allowed to make fun of your hometown, but if someone else makes fun of it, you're like, hey, wait a minute, that's not fair. I can do that. It reminds me a bit of that.
Well, here's something that this is gonna be a little different for you and I because you're the youngest brother and I'm the eldest brother.
Okay, I can see this.
Where somebody goes and is picking on your younger sibling, and you may well do that all the time. It's kind of part of growing up. But when somebody else does it, when a friggin' outsider gets in there, it's like, no. Only I pick on him.
You're out there. No one else
deal
is.
with me. You deal with me. But
I get that.
That's brotherly love. This is ruthless state politics. Anyway, well, this wasn't entirely a free hand for the Hunnic ruling brothers in the Balkans. It was definitely an opportunity they took advantage of at this point. Specifically, there was a renewed significant raiding of Thrace and Illyrium. But they were not alone. So when I say that it was not a free hand, it's not that Rome didn't care about what was going on in the Balkans. They just had bigger fish to fry at the moment. And of course, the Huns knew that. And prior to all of this, they were also getting paid by Constantinople to keep the peace as well. And it's a nasty situation, to say the least. But as we discussed in the previous episode with regards to the Hunnic warfare, one thing that truly set them apart on the battlefield from their Gothic predecessors at this point is their implementation of large siege weaponry and equipment. And this plays very heavily into what I'm about to discuss. How they acquired this ability and managed to deploy it successfully in force is somewhat debated. One of the predominant theories on the subject, as we mentioned prior, is it was perhaps a combination of differing factors. Foremost is the Huns taking advantage of mostly intact siege weapons from their defeated enemies and more or less reverse engineering the technology. Though that alone, for some scholars, is not explanation enough. It also seems very likely that the Huns benefited from knowledge from defectors from Roman forces, or very closely aligned Roman forces that would have had a great deal of experience with this type of technology.
And it's interesting, Paul, because we talked about the Hunnic ranks in our last episode and how despite being the Hunnic army, there weren't many actual Huns in there. They took on a lot of people from outside the tribe to join their forces.
They certainly did. We actually kind of made an interesting comparison between how the Huns operated at this point in time and how some of Napoleon's later armies and some of his later campaigns also worked. So there was quite a few defections to the Huns, as well as other forces that would align with them for a lot of good reasons, mostly plunder and booty, that kind of thing. That, and Attila in particular, was known for being very rewarding to allies and those who showed loyalty to him. And the interesting thing was, and this is the similarity to Napoleon, you had Hunnic officers, but the rank and file a lot of times were not Hun at all. So it is interesting how that works out, and it's believed by some scholars that some of that knowledge from those who came over, especially if you're talking about engineers and whatnot, they put this to use. Unfortunately, they put it to some extremely devastating use. As far as Attila is concerned, and this is something I wanna loop back around on, when it came to Attila and defectors, Attila tended to treat them rather well in terms of those who came over to him, while at the same time being absolutely ruthless for those that abandoned him. We spoke briefly before about how in certain peace treaties, Attila would seek out the return of those who had crossed the lines and defected to the other side. When Attila secured the return of these, quote, fugitives from the Hunnic perspective, apparently they were executed immediately upon their return.
It sounds like he really valued loyalty. Like, he treated defectors who joined him amazingly well. He easily could have just killed him. He'd been like, no, you're part of the enemy army. But no, he realized that this is more meant for my cause. And conversely, how he treated people who abandoned him. Like, this guy seems to have been all about the loyalty.
It seems to be, among other things, probably the virtue that he put the most value upon.
Yeah.
And that much is very clear. And he had good reason for doing it. So the point is, he's one of those guys that if I were to put it in any way in particular, you definitely want to stick around. The rewards are great. Don't piss him off. Don't piss him off.
Keep him in the good books.
Absolutely. But back to the Balkans, especially from about 440 to 443. As I mentioned, this was an opportunity that presented itself to the Huns due to the conflict in Armenia especially. And the Huns' mounting ability was siege weapons, and the outcome was harrowing. Specifically, Sigidunum, which is modern Belgrade, or Sirmium, was left in absolute ruins. These cities were considered major urban areas in the Balkans at that point that could only have been sacked due to the Huns' mounting military ability, specifically with siege weaponry. And in 443, Nisus, which is the birthplace of Constantine the Great, was set ablaze and left in total ashes. These were three major points of this greater opportunistic raiding / pillaging and outright destruction. But where it becomes harrowing are the stories of those who traveled through these areas in the years immediately following their destruction. These travelers noted that there were very few people remaining in the general area, and those that did remain were living in the most basic of conditions, essentially a situation where they were struggling to meet their basic needs for survival. For those that needed to encamp in the area during their travels, in the case of Nisus, they had to set up camp a sizable distance away from the major river that ran through the area. And the reason they could not encamp in a reasonable proximity to said river is because starting at its banks and ranging a fair distance out, the landscape was strewn with ashes from burnt homes, businesses, bodies, and bones. These cities had been wholly and completely obliterated, Mr. Foot.
That doesn't sound like a fun place to set up shop, I imagine. Hence why they didn't encamp there.
Absolutely. Those that did survive the melee at Hunnic direction were captured and, of course, forced into slavery. Some of them got ransomed out. Some of them have had better fate, more or less at the direction of their slave masters. But you know what? Slavery being the experience that it is a genuinely awful, harrowing experience. Additionally, insofar as additional territorial progress, the Huns made it, though it's not territory that they could hold. It is said that they may have made it and advanced as far south as Thermopylae, the legendary site of the 300 Spartan stand against the invading Persians centuries prior.
That is centuries prior. That's a very long time ago comparatively to where we are in AD history right now.
Absolutely. Wow. So, I mean, they had a run of this portion of Europe.
Yeah.
Because Rome, it's not that Eastern Rome didn't care, it's that Eastern Rome couldn't do a hell of a lot about it.
To do anything about it. And it's interesting because when we see later accounts of the Huns' handiworks in the Balkans during this period of history, do we not start getting a feeling as to why the Huns, and especially Attila himself, achieved the ruthless reputation they did?
I mean, you look at their handiwork, right?
It's understandable why that happened, why they got that image.
It is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, so
it's absolutely terrifying.
When were they eventually halted? Like, surely this madness had to have come to an end at some point.
Yes, it did. So basically, eventually, the Eastern Empire came to the resolution with the Sassanids, which wasn't great. They ended up, I believe, having to pay them off in part. And in this case, they had to do something actually somewhat similar with Attila. And this kind of played out towards what really Attila's greater foreign policy aims were, which is that in times when they felt they could get away with it, they would basically extort the Eastern Empire for large amounts of money for the peace. And when Rome couldn't do anything about it from a martial military standpoint, where they had to dedicate their forces elsewhere, they proceeded to enrich themselves through pillaging the hell out of the Balkans.
And, like, do we know, did he have a greater aim? Because there's pillaging, like, there's killing and robbing. But then there's that, like, was there a reason he wanted to go so extreme with his actions there?
I often wonder that myself. I have not found a great answer to that.
Was it like a scare tactic?
I'm sure. I'm sure it has a lot to do with it, because when you see a Hun on the horizon, I mean, you almost surrender from fear.
It reminds me of someone like, this is going back, this is going forwards quite a lot of time from where we are now, but someone like Vladimir the Impaler, or Vlad the Impaler, who famously, well, not only did he impale, but he kept them outside of his city in Transylvania as sort of a show of fear. He kept those impaled bodies around his castle as sort of a fear tactic. Something like that's coming to mind for me.
Isn't he like the very, very rough inspiration for Count Dracula?
He is indeed. He was called Vladimir Dracula. Like, he's very much inspired by him.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I thought not to go on too terrible a side note here, but I've always found Dracula, the actual story, very interesting, which is to say that there's this very popularized general understanding of Dracula, and then there's the story.
Yes.
And the story is a lot more interesting than the popular perception.
Yes, and I may lie. His name wasn't Vlad Drac. His last name was just Dracula. It's where the name comes from. And yeah, it's very much inspired like Transylvania from Romania. It's very much linked to it. But yeah, the actual story is very different to like the Christopher Lee Widow's Peak Paul Black hair that we associate with the character now.
Even though I love Christopher Lee to pieces.
Yeah.
I mean, I miss that. I miss that, man.
Yes.
It just, there are some actors that are just truly wonderful. Yeah. But in any case, so yes, certainly. And even though you can't compare the scope of achievement, this is also one of those times where you can very much understand why people will say Attila the Hun and then immediately go to Genghis Khan.
Yeah. And yeah, that I to this day still get a bit confused between the two of them. But obviously that's a bit more cleared up now.
Yeah, just because when you hear stories about what happened in the Balkans, where literally like years later, travelers going through an area of a city that they just wholly sacked and then set ablaze, where you can literally see the remnants of human remains along the river to the point where you can't even camp nearby. That's very, very Genghis Khan.
I think something else worth mentioning here, it's like a tangent. It's easy to forget how long, you said like when people came through years later, how long it can take to clear up devastation.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
Even, and this is a very modern example, even in the 60s, there were still bombed out rubble sites in London. Like, you think the 60s sounds so far removed from, like, the Second World War and the Blitz, but there were still signs of it there. So how long it would take without sort of modern technology to sort out these sort of devastated, raided sites, it would be a very long-term impact. Like, the impact of these sackings would be witnessed for years and years to come.
And, it's interesting that you mentioned that. So, obviously, right now, there's a very serious, very bloody conflict happening in Ukraine.
That's exactly what I was about to mention.
And when you go back to so much of the fighting, the vast majority of the fighting that occurred during the Second World War, in terms of especially combat deaths, but as well as civilian casualties as well, happened on the Eastern Front between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And when you go to places like the Donbass or fields of Ukraine or Belarus, you name it, that because of the nature of the soil, and you know how there's the Rasputitsa and it gets really muddy and whatnot, in the spring, when everything begins to thaw, the soil begins to surrender its dead from that conflict, where bones will just come up.
To this day.
It still happens every year.
It's insane.
Every year. And there's no sign of it stopping, given just the millions of people who perish there that would obviously not have received a proper burial.
That's insane.
It's very disturbing.
It's very disturbing. But on to somehow something less disturbing.
Yeah, but still death.
But still death. And you were saying, like, with Ukraine, bless some of the sites, is the last bit of this tangent, some of the sites we're seeing from places like Mariupol, even Kyiv itself, like, overnight, those places have received destruction that is going to take years upon years upon years to rebuild.
So many wars have been fought in those areas, and there's a reason that, from roughly what we consider today to be Western Poland out to as far west as Moscow or the Caucasus, if you will. There's a reason why, and then you go south, as far south as Romania and Bulgaria and whatnot, the Balkans. There's a reason that area of Europe is called the Bloodlands of Europe. It's... Yeah.
But yes,
anyway.
Back to death. Keep things jolly.
Yes. Well, in this case, it is the death of a single individual that really does change things in a very significant way. And that is the death of Bleda, Attila's brother, in 445 AD. Because as I had mentioned at the beginning, and if you've been following along with this chapter by chapter account of Attila's greater life and rule, as I mentioned before, when they inherited the kingdom from their uncle Rua, they were not co-rulers. They created two kingdoms and they were two separate rulers. But one of the strangest issues I have encountered in the story of Attila is actually the death of Bleda, whom, as I mentioned, split the kingdom with him. The reason this one is one of the strangest issues I encountered regarding Attila is there is no clear indication of exactly how Bleda met his fate. Some sources claim that Bleda perished in unclear circumstances. I seem to recall one source that believed Bleda may have died due to natural causes, such as illness. I've also found sources that have unequivocally claimed that Bleda was murdered by Attila. But insofar as I am concerned, based on my findings, this matter is wholly unclear. And that is unfortunate. But even though we can do some digging here, and we can see who the clear beneficiary of Bleda's death, which is, of course, Attila, that doesn't necessarily suggest that it was Attila who was responsible. Because, like I said, I have gotten no clear answer on this whatsoever. However, it is the consequences of Bleda's death that are so important.
Yes.
From what I can tell, Attila went on to inherit the lion's share of Bleda's Hunnic kingdom. With this arrangement as it was, it meant that Attila's Hunnic kingdom was genuinely vast.
So,
and I mean big time vast.
There's sort of that classic sort of saying that it's spread all the way up to the North Sea. Is that actually the case? Because that's humongous if that's the case. The North Sea is so far from where we are right now.
That is often the line that is left to history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Though for some of the more authoritative sources I have found, it does appear that particular claim would be somewhat exaggerated. There's no question that Attila controlled more or less a vast swath of the Hungarian plain, but evidence that his territory stretched all the way to the North Sea is apparently somewhat dubious. Now, apparently, he was the only Hunnic ruler of consequence during this time, but what is certain is that there were other lesser Hunnic rulers out there for a limited time, but he did not control everything without question entirely under his thumb. There were other major political players, but there's no question that in terms of the Huns, relatively limited time of being a major power of consequence in continental Europe, which, like I said, it doesn't last very long.
No.
It really goes from about at the very end of the 4th century until about this mid-5th century. Like, not even a full century are the European Huns major players on the scene. But for those times that they were on the scene, Attila was the guy. It all came to him.
You don't need to be on the scene. Like, you can just come, do something monumental, and then disappear again. Like, their job was done, I guess some could argue. But yeah, like you said, the time they were there, they made an impact. That's for sure.
Because we're still talking about them, and it wasn't even like a true century of challenging these greater powers. I mean, compare it to, a power like Eastern Rome, or as they are now starting to slowly become called, and in some sources and in some historical works are now being called, the Byzantines. The Byzantines last all the way out to
the
more
Ottomans,
or less
1500s, 1400s.
It's the late 15th century, so the late 1400s, basically out towards more or less the first Columbian voyage.
It's madness how long the Byzantines last for.
Yeah, that stretch of Rome in that eastern portion literally survived into more or less the European Renaissance.
Yeah.
Well, this is definitely a transitional point that will lead to the climax and conclusion of our Attila story in the next episode.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. I'm loving this story of Attila. But for now, we've got to say goodbye to Attila. I'm looking forward to saying hello one last time to him. But we're going to throw over now to our very own Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast.
Well, that does it for us today. Patrick, where can people find us?
You can find me personally primarily on Instagram at NameExplainYT. But you can also find me on Twitter at NameExplainYT, and of course on YouTube, search NameExplain. What about you, Paul?
In addition to my usual work at TGNR at tgnreview.com, you can find me at my Twitter handle at PKD in History, as well as my reader-submitted World War II Q&A column, The World War II Brain Bucket, where I answer all World War II related questions, which if you are on YouTube, we will have a link down in the description.
That's all today from myself. Goodbye, thank you, and take care.
Yes, thank you all so much. Until next time.
Like all good things, we come to an end for today. Thank you for listening to the AD History Podcast. It is listeners such as yourself who make this show possible and truly awesome. Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History Podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found. Also, follow AD History on social media. Follow the show on Twitter at the handle at ADHistoryPC, as well as on Facebook by visiting facebook.com/ADHistoryPodcast and Instagram as AD History Podcast. In addition to liking and subscribing on YouTube by searching AD History Podcast. Do you have a direct comment or question for Paul and Patrick? Drop them an email at adhistorypodcast@tgnreview.com. Also, be sure to visit the show's homepage at tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. For Paul and Patrick, thank you for listening to the AD History. We'll see you again next time in the ever-growing tapestry of world history.